So I just want to take a very brief moment and thank you all for being here. Welcome to the DharmaRealm Temple. Really just an honor to have Scott here. We got to spend a little bit of time this morning catching up, and the biggest thrill to me is when he asked what church this was, and I said it's an old Swedenborgian church, and he's one of the only people in the last 7 years who actually knows who Emanuel Swedenborg is. So while we're here to talk about Buddhism in America, I'm still glad to have it by somebody who knows the person that built this place. So thanks for being here. Good luck with this crowd. They're all yours.
Thank you. Jeff, did you want to, you said you were going to have a few minutes of settling? Or
Yeah, if you want, go ahead. Yeah, you want the bell?
You should lead that.
Is it-
No, sure.
You are the, yes. You have all the power now.
Oh, geez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
I thought maybe just a few minutes to have some silence and collect ourselves, or maybe just collect myself. Good morning, everyone. It's really very much a huge pleasure to be here and an honor. Jeff and I were talking earlier today about all the people that we have, all the people we know in common. I think that's just because all the Buddhists know each other, right? There aren't that many of us. I also remembered visiting the original Buddha for You store when I was somewhere else in San Diego many years ago. So I'm happy to see the other side of that community and happy to be here with you all today. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about this book that I wrote, The Making of American Buddhism. But then hopefully we also have time for discussion and questions, which I always find much more rewarding and engaging than just listening to somebody talk. So to begin, I want to go back in time to 1942. Early in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed what was called Executive Order 9066. This was not long after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Executive Order 9066 essentially declared that the west coast of the United States was to be under military protection, that it was going to be deemed particularly a threat as we entered into World War II. This was the pretext under which the United States government forcibly removed 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans from their homes and put them into basically internment camps or incarceration camps for the duration of World War II. And when I say that the American government put 120,000 people into these camps, they picked up everybody who had any Japanese ancestry, including women and children, and even half Japanese orphaned babies were put into incarceration camps. Now, this happened over the course of about a month. You can't round up 120,000 people without some planning. And so I think it goes without saying that for several years before the US entered World War II, the Department of Defense and the FBI were anticipating that the US would probably enter into World War II, and they were concerned about the large number of Japanese immigrants and their children who lived here on the West Coast. And so plans were already in motion long before World War II started, or long before Pearl Harbor, to carry out this incarceration of Japanese Americans. Now, the Department of Defense and the FBI, to do this, started surveilling many Japanese communities, many Japanese organizations and social organizations and civic organizations, including the large number of Buddhist temples that were here along the West Coast. And they had lists. Duncan Williams is a teacher at the University of Southern California, an old mentor of mine. He wrote a book called American Sutra. If you don't buy my book, buy American Sutra. It's a wonderful book that talks about this history of the incarceration during World War II. He shows that the FBI had lists of Japanese civic leaders, and they had rankings of who they thought would be more or less loyal to the United States if we went to war with Japan. The people who were considered to be more loyal were Japanese Christians. But the Buddhists, they believed, would be most likely to side with the Japanese Empire and could possibly be, saboteurs and so on and so forth. And immediately after Pearl Harbor, the first people who were arrested were Japanese Buddhist priests. Now, I say this because it's the tragedy of the internment of Japanese Americans was clearly racially motivated. It was clearly about the fact that these people were not white folks, but they were also not Christian. So there's a relationship there between both race and religion, which I think is important, and this is what Duncan Williams talks about in his book. But I also think this is interesting because, like many people in this room, if you're like me, middle-aged, bald white guy, who came to Buddhism late in life, I wasn't raised Buddhist, I wasn't raised in a particularly religious context at all. My associations with Buddhism, as I came to know Buddhism, are things like the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh. Essentially, Buddhism is this peaceful, wonderful religion, and it's growing in popularity in the latter half of the 20th century. But in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, Buddhism is associated with the religion of the enemy. And it's deemed such a threat by the US government that it's one of the reasons why 120,000 people are illegally incarcerated. So that's kind of weird that we live in a world now where Buddhism is very, very popular and it's very, very well known, and it's associated with very specific ideas, in particular things like peacefulness. But not that long ago, it was associated with violence, and it was this scary, scary thing. And so one of the questions that I'm asking in my book is, how did that happen? how did we go from this place in public consciousness where Buddhism used to be something that was a threat and then pretty quickly became something wildly popular and understood to mean certain kinds of things associated with certain things like peacefulness or the Buddhism as a religion of science, or it's a philosophy, and all of these things. How did that happen? How did that transformation happen so quickly, immediately after World War II? So a colleague of mine, when she read my book, she described it as an origin story, and I like that description. I didn't intend to write an origin story, but I like origin stories. Origin stories are fun, right? All the Marvel movies, those are all origin stories. I haven't actually seen many of them. there's too many Marvel movies, so that's a different subject. But origin stories are good because they remind us of where we came from, how did things happen in certain ways. And I think that there are a lot of origin stories for American Buddhism. How did Buddhism become a thing in America? How did Buddhism become popular? How did it emerge and become not just a religion, but a very particular, very specific kind of religion here in the United States? And a lot of that origin story that many people might be familiar with has to do with certain people that we tend to associate with Buddhism, like the Dalai Lama, for example, or Chogyam Trungpa, who was a Tibetan monk who brought a former Tibetan monk who brought certain kinds of Tibetan Buddhism to America in the 1960s. D.T. Suzuki is another very well-known person. People have heard of D.T. Suzuki. And of course, we can also think of people who are associated with like the Beat Generation, people like Alan Watts. I'm going to guess that one or two people in this room have read a book by Jack Kerouac. One or two maybe. the DharmaRealm. Have you read that book, Jack?
Isn't that good?
So the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, all of those guys in the late 50s and early 60s, and then into the 60s and 70s, we see this sort of popularization and spread of particular ideas about Buddhism, about Zen Buddhism. Transcendental meditation is coming over. The Beatles go to India. All that stuff is happening in the post-war period. And that, I think, is oftentimes what people think of when they think of sort of the origin story of American Buddhism, how Buddhism became popularized in the broader culture. What I'm looking at in my book, though, pushes that origin story back a little bit. Again, 120,000 people were rounded up for World War II, many of whom were rounded up specifically because they were Buddhists. So this tells us that Buddhism was here long before Jack Kerouac hitchhiked across the country, long before D.T. Suzuki or Alan Watts became household names. There were hundreds of thousands of Japanese Buddhists already living in this country, and many of whom were very, very interested in promoting Buddhism more broadly, not just within the Japanese community. And so that's sort of becomes the focus of my book. In particular, I'm interested in the Japanese experience, which the first Japanese immigrants come to Hawaii as early as 1868 or 1873. This was before Hawaii is even a U.S. territory. So in many ways, Buddhism in America is older than America itself in some ways. At least Hawaii. On the mainland, the first Japanese Buddhists come in 1899. And two priests, for example, came to San Francisco, and they established what was called at the time the Buddhist Mission of North America, and is now called the Buddhist Churches of America. And the Buddhist Churches of America oversaw dozens of temples in the first part of the 20th century, all up and down the West Coast, from Vancouver all the way down here to San Diego. In fact, there's a Japanese Buddhist temple here in San Diego that was built in 1926. But they also had temples across the country in places like Salt Lake City, in Denver, New York, even the Midwest. It was a very large national organization. And my book focuses mostly on the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, which was built in 1911. Now, when this temple first was established, it served primarily the Japanese immigrant community and had a lot of activities, not just Buddhist activities, but other activities in support of that community, like a lot of immigrant communities would. But over time, those activities expanded, especially as kids were born and started to grow up. They had a wider range of publication projects and study groups and so on and so forth. And Berkeley's also an interesting location because there are a lot of universities, not just the University of California, Berkeley, but there are several other large universities in the area. And that drew a lot of people to that part of the Bay Area. And they all started to come together at the Berkeley Temple and created a really vibrant youth group. I was thinking on the way down here about the fraternity group that y'all have, the college group that is, I think it's probably very similar. It's a youth group that the young people are really excited. They have all these dreams and aspirations. And they started publishing a magazine called the Berkeley Busei. Busei is a Japanese term that roughly translates as, Buddhist, basically. And so in 1939, this group of young people started publishing a magazine, and they published the magazine twice a year up until 1942, when the incarceration happened. And then immediately after they were released from the camps and they returned to Berkeley, they picked up again and started publishing the Busei again every year through 1960. And the Busei is a really interesting magazine. It included, in the early days, it included, it was almost like a temple newsletter. It included stories about what's happening at the temple, member lists, these are the things that are happening that we're doing. But it also included a lot of really deep and interesting essays about Buddhism and Buddhist practice and what it meant to be a Buddhist. And it was also at times overtly political. A lot of the young people who were writing for this magazine were growing up in this context where they were being treated as second-class citizens. They were very much aware of the contradictions of American racial and political life, and they wrote about that and very much made a claim that they wanted to sort of claim this identity as American Buddhists. And make this sort of claim that America says that it's a multi-religious, everyone's welcome here kind of country. Let's be Buddhist and be proud of that. So there's a lot of really interesting essays like that in the Busei. After the war, things started to get a little bit more interesting. The head priest at the temple at the time was a man named Kanmo Imamura. And he and his wife, Jane, did all kinds of outreach. They started all kinds of programs where they invited people to come into the temple, to give talks, to lead study classes. As early as 1949, there was a study group where a bunch of college kids came together and started studying the Dharma. Not just the Japanese American kids that were at the temple, but other folks from the community started coming. In 1952, they held a 2-day symposium at the temple. It was attended by hundreds of people, including our good friend Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki. So because of all this interest in Buddhism at the time, they started to attract whoever happened to be in Berkeley at the time. Eventually, this included some other folks like Gary Snyder. I'm not sure if people know who Gary Snyder is. He's a rather well-known poet. He's associated with the Beat Generation, but he himself doesn't like that term, we'll just say. Jack Kerouac created a fictional version of Gary Snyder in his novel, The Dharma Bums. Because of Gary Snyder, not only did Jack Kerouac come to the Berkeley Temple, but he also invited his friend Philip Whalen. Philip Whalen's also a well-known poet who became a Zen teacher as well. Jack Kerouac actually published a couple of poems in the Berkeley Busei later in the 1950s, including part of one of his poems that's called Mexico City Blues. If there's any Kerouac fans out there, Mexico City Blues is one of those really epically long poems, and he published a couple of stanzas in the Berkeley Busei before he published his first novel, On the Road. So there's this connection between these pretty well-known figures and this temple in Berkeley, run primarily by Japanese Americans. So I say all this as a way of saying that, you know, there's some interconnection, some interdependence between the sort of later popularity of Buddhism as we get to the late 50s and early 60s, and this community that predated that popularity by several decades. So that becomes a pretty big part of my book. But the other side of this that I think is important is not so much, you know, listing a sort of who's who of you know, all the famous Buddhists who came through Berkeley 70 years ago, but to refocus our attention on the other folks that we don't usually see who are making these things possible. So I mentioned Kanmo Imamura and his wife Jane. Jane Imamura she was a force. She was one of these people who did everything at the temple. She organized the children's groups, she organized musical groups, she was very much helpful in all the publications that they were putting out. And a lot of this work that she was doing, we don't often see it. We don't often see this kind of work. And I think the reason why is because when we think about Buddhist practice, we often think about what we're doing in here, right? We think about the meditation or the chanting or the offering of incense or other things. We think about this space as being where we do the Buddhist practice. This is where the real practice is. I also think that oftentimes we tend to focus our attention on whoever is sitting up here. That this becomes the teacher becomes the person who gets all the attention in the community. And what happens as a result, we tend not to see other kinds of labor that's happening, sort of behind the scenes, off stage. So I wrote a book, and my name's on the cover of it, but a dozen other people did work on that book. A dozen other people edited it and did the copy editing and page layout and shipped it around the world, and the Amazon drivers are going to bring it to you. All of those people are responsible for making this book possible, and none of them are going to get any credit because my name's on the cover, right? And I think a similar thing happens when we're talking about what's happening at a temple or in a community. We see part of what's happening, but we don't really acknowledge this other part. Somebody was kind enough to bring me a glass of water. A Lyft driver was kind enough to bring me here today. There's a sense of interdependence that we know from our practice, that we're not individuals, right? We're not little islands unto ourselves, but all of this interdependence, all of these causes and conditions brought us here. So when I look at the history of American Buddhism, I wanted to look away from the famous people who were sitting at the front of the room. I look away from Alan Watts or D.T. Suzuki and ask, who else is there? Who else is making things possible? And Jane Imamura is one of these people. Jane was not just the wife of a minister, but she also helped organize the temple. She writes in her memoirs about how she used to be asked to go pick up speakers from the airport, for example. And so she has this story about picking up D.T. Suzuki from the airport in San Francisco, you know, way back before they had major freeways, so it would take all day to get there. And she has her baby on the seat next to her. And while I was doing research for the book, I had this archive of materials. And I found this letter from D.T. Suzuki to the Imamuras, and it's written, handwritten letter in Japanese. And you know, my Japanese isn't great. So I asked a colleague, Kyo, actually came out of my office, and I was like, look at this letter, it's from D.T. Suzuki. Can you read it? It's just, you know, scribbled handwriting, and he looked at it for a little while. I was like, yeah. It looks like he's saying my plane arrives at 8 p.m. so Suzuki, here I think I have this letter that's like this piece of wisdom from D.T. Suzuki that's going to change the history of everything. but really it's just his itinerary that he's sending to his friends to have him pick him up from the airport. And even though it's not this profound bit of wisdom, I still think it's important. I still think it's actually crucial and vital to the history of Buddhism in this country. And it reminded me immediately of the first time I traveled to Asia, and how overwhelming and exhausting that is to travel to a country where you don't have a great grasp of the local language and you don't really know where you're going. Even in a contemporary world where there's a lot more infrastructure to get people around, it's still overwhelming. And you're on a plane for hours and you're just tired and you don't know where you are. Having somebody meet you at the airport who's going to pick you up and take you where you need to go is an incredible act of kindness. It's an incredible act of generosity and compassion. And I believe that it's because of those things that other work is able to get done. Suzuki wrote and popularized a particular kind of Zen Buddhism, and became a really well-known figure in the 1950s and 1960s. And he was able to do this in part because other people were supporting him, other people were helping him. And those are the stories that I want to get to in my work. The work that we do here, the practice that we do here is important, but there's other kinds of practice as well, other kinds of work that we do that is also a kind of Buddhist practice. The generosity and the selfless giving of picking somebody up from the airport is a kind of Buddhist practice. And so that's part of what I want to get at in the book. And sometimes people, don't want to think that kind of work is Buddhist practice, but I would encourage you to look up Dogen's essay, Instructions for the Cook. All kinds of work can be considered Buddhist practice if you think about it. I'm talking a lot, and I want to close here in a moment. But before I do, I want to say a couple more things. Writing a book like this takes a long time. I've been doing the research on this book for more years than I can remember, and I actually did most of the writing for this book over the course of 2020 and 2021. 2020 was a weird year, right? It was a very strange time, and it was a very strange experience to be sort of immersed in this history, and while people are storming the Capitol and the state of California is on fire and all these strange things are happening. I found myself asking that question that I think a lot of historians do. What does this history have to do with where we are today, apart from that sort of cliche of those who forget history are going to repeat it? What kind of lessons can we learn from this history? And I'll be honest, I don't know if I have a good answer to that question, even in my own work. But one of the figures that I spent a lot of time sort of thinking with or reading about was a fellow named Hiroshi Kashiwagi, who wrote many essays in Berkeley Crusade. Kashiwagi was a Japanese American who was born before World War II. After World War II, he eventually became a playwright and an actor and an essayist and a poet. And he was actually, fun fact, good friends with George Takei. And many people think that he convinced George Takei to become an actor. So if it wasn't for Kashiwagi, Star Trek would be totally different. So Kashiwagi is a really interesting story, and many of his essays were really profoundly moving for me when I was reading them in the Crusade. And the more I learned about his life, the more his life and the experiences he had really resonated with me. Kashiwagi was probably 19 or 20 at the outbreak of World War II. He and his family were eventually interred at a place called Tule Lake. Tule Lake is on the very northern border of California. The Tule Lake camp became the camp where all of the troublemakers were sent during World War II. People who the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice felt were sort of undesirable, got sent to this camp. So it has a sort of stigma attached to it. While he was in the camp, Kashiwagi He was born in America, so he was a US citizen, but he was so frustrated by what was happening that he actually renounced his US citizenship. And it turns out several thousand other Japanese Americans did the same thing while they were in camp. This then created a pretty significant legal problem when they were released from camp, because now the department, the U.S. government was going to deport them to a country that most of them had never been to before. It's also true that many of these young Japanese Americans didn't actually speak that much Japanese, so it would have been a pretty harrowing thing to have to go to Japan. So Kashiwagi eventually met a lawyer in San Francisco, a civil rights attorney named Wayne Collins. And what Wayne Collins did was he recognized that all of these people who had renounced their citizenship in the camp, they had done this under duress. And so he worked for 10 years suing the US government to get these renunciations of citizenship overturned, and eventually he won, restoring the citizenship for all these young people who went through this horrible tragedy. In his memoir, Kashiwagi talks about how that sort of selfless act of the civil rights attorney restored his faith in what it meant to be an American. It restored his faith in sort of the goodness and humanity of people. And this, to me, is, I think, one of the lessons that I take from this history, is that this community went through a series of traumatic events, and then after the war, just got to work and came back together again and recreated their community and started promoting Buddhism, promoting the Dharma across America in ways that we're still seeing today. We still see the sort of interdependence and interconnections all the way down to the present. And they did it in community. They did it together. There wasn't a person who came out and said, this is what we're going to do, but the community sort of came together. And I find that to be, perhaps that's the lesson that we can learn from this history, and the part that gives me a little bit of hope. Jeff and I were joking about how the college kids have this belief that they can do anything, and then you get old and you're like, oh, I'm too tired. But I do have a little bit of hope that even though the state's on fire and there's all kinds of terrible things happening in the world, that when we come together and create a community, that's where we can really create some positive change. So I'm going to stop talking, and we can have a conversation, right? So thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you. The history is really interesting, so I guess I have a history question. Very, very ignorant and green on this, but I know obviously Buddhism didn't start in Japan. I'm just kind of curious, how it ended up coming to Japan, and are we saying that the Japanese people were just extremely effective in spreading Buddhism in the United States? Because obviously it wouldn't be just Japanese who were following Buddhist practices. So I'm not really sure how those dots connect.
Sure. Buddhism came to Japan in the 700s, and it came to Japan in a couple different ways. The sort of legendary story is that the king of Korea gifted some Buddhist artifacts to the emperor of Japan, and then he spread them. But it might have actually been his sister who spread them. One of those fun bits of history that people like to sort of quietly shuffle under the rug. The truth is more complicated, of course, and Buddhism developed over the next several centuries into some distinctive Japanese schools of Buddhism. Zen comes from China, but it has a different flavor in Japan. Japan also has a much more sectarian, kind of a denominational kind of sense of Buddhism. Buddhism, when it came to the United States, part of the answer to that question has to do with immigration law. In the the mid-1800s, the United States started creating more and more strict immigration laws. Part of this was in response to the Chinese immigrants who came during the gold rush. So one of the first restrictions was an anti-Chinese immigration ban, and then Japanese immigrants sort of filled that void. And when the Japanese immigrants were coming here, they were also very effective at establishing Buddhist communities. So many of the Chinese immigrants who came, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before the Japanese immigrants, they almost certainly brought Buddhism with them, but not in as much of a sort of directed institutional kind of way. So when the Japanese immigrants came, they immediately started setting up temples and organizations to support Buddhist organizations. And then early in the 20th century, the United States government clamped down even more, basically saying that no immigrants from Asia could come to the United States at all. And that was the reality for 20 or 30 years. The only immigrants who were allowed into the country were folks mostly from China who were fleeing communism. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the United States reversed those immigration policies, and then we see a big uptick in more Asian immigration. I say this because were there other Asian Buddhists in America? Yes, of course. But for a long period of time in the first part of the 20th century, it was pretty much the Japanese who were the only ones who had like an institutional presence.
So they like put in an infrastructure right away where
Yes.
others did not, and then
Right.
that allowed some momentum for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, and so, and thank you for saying infrastructure, because that's actually a big part of the book. I think that infrastructure is actually really important. Later on, I see these reports of, Thai monk comes to San Francisco and, is shown around by, this Japanese priest. And the reason why is because there's actually a temple in San Francisco that was established, a long time ago, and there were no other Buddhists, right? So you can imagine coming to San Francisco in 1940 and saying, I'm interested in Buddhism. You open up the phone book, well, there's a Buddhist temple. And it's the only one in town, which is not the case now, right? I joke that in Berkeley, where I live, you can't throw a rock at anything Buddhist. So there's just so much more diversity.
Well, it's kind of like if you build it, they will come, right?
Exactly,
So and obviously more variations of Buddhist practices or philosophies. I'm not sure how to word that, but. I'm sorry, I had a two-part question on this too, and I don't know if I have an opinion on it. I would just find it surprising. So my son was taking a cultural geography class or something, and they were talking about world religions, and my son mentioned that what about Hinduism and Buddhism? And the professor was very clear that those were not religions. So I thought that was interesting. And then it made me think, well, why? I mean, what then is the definition of religion? And I couldn't use the words. That's why I'm asking that question. Like, well, then, why is that? Or what's your take on that idea that it's not a religion? Why we need to call it that?
So I think the short answer is that religion is just a word that people made up to describe certain kinds of social behavior, and that's sort of the short answer. The longer answer is that religion is really complicated, and it's complicated because it's not just is this a religion, is that a religion, is it a philosophy, yada yada yada, but it's also intersecting with things like the law. Like it matters that, I'm assuming this is a 501c3 religious organization. Yeah, that matters. For tax purposes, right? So, and we're glad. So I bring that up because I think that it's easy for people to say, oh, well, Buddhism is more of a philosophy. And yeah, Buddhism has philosophy, absolutely. But so does Christianity, exactly. Religions, most religion scholars would be able to say, religions have to have sort of these criteria or these characteristics. most definitions would include things like people coming together on particular days or times to share community and space together. Certain ritual practices, certain iconography that points to larger worldviews or mythologies or cosmologies, however you want to call it, ethics or morals. An answer to the deeper question of what is the meaning of life and why are we here? All of those things, I think, constitute a religion. I don't think that means that Buddhism doesn't have a philosophy, and if people want to think that it's just a philosophy, that's fine. But I think that regardless of those sort of like philosophical questions of what is religion and all that kind of stuff, regardless of that, I always want to sort of go back to the fact that this is a 501c3. And so how we define religion actually has real world consequences. And if you wanted to take that hard stance that Buddhism is not a religion, then just go start paying taxes.
Perspective that kind of had that pessimist.
I had a question. Talk about Buddhism, the history of Buddhism. It seems to be centered on the West Coast. But what is the history of Buddhism going east?
That's a good question. And I think it would depend sort of on when we're talking about. As far as the early 20th century is concerned, a lot of the early 20th century history of Buddhism in this country follows immigration patterns. And so most Asian immigration happened on the West Coast, but we also see some folks moving to places like Denver or other parts in the Midwest, sort of as part of farming communities. So we see little pockets of Buddhism out there. At the same time, though, there's also a lot of sort of elite intellectual interest in Buddhism happening on the East Coast. And so, for example, there's a really well-known Zen school in New York. The name is not going to come to me. The Zen Study Center or something. I think they've changed their name a couple of times. That was established by a Japanese priest who came, I think, in the 1920s or 30s, but then it got funding from a very well-known, a very rich person, sort of in the elite circles of New York high society. And then eventually D.C. Suzuki starts teaching there. And so that center becomes more of like an educational kind of center, and it dovetails with what I would consider more of like an elite intellectual kind of interest in Buddhism. This sometimes overlaps with like the arts. The Boston Museum, for example, has a really amazing Asian art collection. And as a result, some interesting Buddhist stuff happens out there. Everything changes after 1965. In 1965, the United States changed its immigration laws. Fun fact, we changed our immigration laws because Johnson wanted to increase immigration from Eastern Europe, but we were fighting a war in Southeast Asia, so we ended up getting a lot more Southeast Asian immigrants. Whoops. Now, one of the interesting things about that story, however, is after the fall of Saigon, when there was a huge refugee crisis coming out of Vietnam, the United States government didn't want any one city or any one state to have to bear the burden of all these refugees coming, so they instituted a policy whereby every state had to take a certain number of refugees from Southeast Asia. Proportional to state population. So this spread Asian immigration across the country in a way that we don't see before World War II. So those sort of connections between immigration and refugee policies and whatnot, I think, explain why it is that there's actually a pretty large population of Buddhists in Florida and the Gulf Coast states, many of whom following our Vietnamese tradition too.
Well, as it goes east, does it change from what it is here?
A colleague of mine named Jeff Wilson would argue vehemently yes. That if we look at where Buddhism shows up in different parts of the country, it looks different. I think that's a really interesting theory and a really interesting hypothesis. And if I had a substantial grant and a bunch of graduate students, I would ask them to go out and do all the research and prove that theory. I think it does change in some ways, but in other ways, American culture, I think, is getting more and more less regionally distinct.
I became aware that actually Tennessee has a lot of temples,
Mhm.
which I find.
Interesting.
Also, historical context question. You had stated that the federal government had seen Japanese Buddhists as threats or sympathetic to the enemy, therefore Buddhism itself was seen as a threat. So once World War II started, or Pearl Harbor started to happen, and they were returned, were they allowed to, or permitted to, or able to continue to practice their Buddhism within the camps themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. The long answer is a bit more complicated. Many Buddhist priests, as well as actually some Christian and Shinto priests as well, rather than being sent to the main camps, were sent to a special camp in Arizona where they were sort of sequestered. So that created some problems in terms of continuing religious practices. But that didn't last for the entirety of the war, and there's a lot of evidence of people doing Buddhist services in the camps. And interestingly enough, they became really sort of ecumenical, so to speak, where you'd have priests from different Buddhist schools all in the same camp together, and they would sort of come together and do services at the same time. There's some contradictions and ironies in the whole camp experience, because the propaganda at the time, as we were going into World War II, was to fight fascism and fight for equality and freedom, but we've just put into prison a whole bunch of people. And so, sort of aware of that, the government also began to do things like actively recruit Japanese Americans from the camps. They created a couple of the most decorated units of World War II in Europe were Japanese units. So Japanese are fighting for the United States while their families are in prison, basically. So there's a lot of sort of weird contradictions there. But as a result of that, Buddhism actually becomes sort of more interwoven into United States policy thinking. Japanese are fighting in Europe, and they're dying, and they want religious services, and they're not Christian. So the military starts to recruit Buddhist priests to become chaplains. So there's a lot of interesting, a lot of really interesting history there.
Where does the work of the Shambhala centers kind of tie into the spreading of Buddhism across America? I could be wrong, but I remember Rinpoche's whole mission was to come from Tibet to spread Buddhism across the United States. So I guess does that come in kind of the same way through the west and out to the east, or?
Yeah, this is actually a good dovetail to that question. My understanding is that his work actually started the opposite direction, from the east to the west, east coast to the west coast. My recollection of his life story is that after he left Tibet at the same time as the Dalai Lama in 59 or whatever, he actually spent some time in Scotland. And then from there came to the United States. One of the big centers of Shambhala is actually in Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada. The other big one, of course, is in Colorado. So Shambhala has centers all across the country, and I feel like they sort of all pop up kind of at the same time, in the late 60s into the 70s. But interestingly enough, sort of from the opposite coast.
Thanks.
So yeah, piggybacking off of the question about were they allowed to practice in the camps, I wonder then, you say that they hired chaplains, and I'm wondering if that actually spread into the military that was not Buddhist. Did it help sort of see some of the people who were overseeing the camps become Buddhist as well, because they saw some of the practices, and if that was a part of it as well.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
And then the other thing I just wanted to say, the woman asking about college, I also took a college religions course, world religions course, and I don't know why they told your son that Hindu was not a religion, but they also said that Buddhism was a philosophy and not a religion, and that was due to the classification of gods, and Buddhism not having like actual gods. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful to you to know, but like that's what they told us. We had a huge discussion over it for a full day in class. So
Well, yeah, I suspected it. It's just, I just found it kind of, I would say unfortunate, because then we're taking away a whole other place of discussion. It just seemed like it was kind of shut down.
for what you're describing, I would agree with you. For the course that I was in, because we took the whole day to describe it, we talked about what he did too, about it being a religion for, purposes of the government, and being a philosophy, as an academic viewpoint, it's a philosophy. As like a personal belief system, it's whatever you choose it to be. As an institution, it's a religion. So there's like different variations of how you look at it, basically.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is, earlier I said, religions have certain characteristics, and I sort of had gestured toward mythology. One of the things that I sometimes lament is that we don't, in a lot of the Buddhist circles that I'm familiar with, we don't spend a ton of time talking about some of the more obscure Buddhist sutras. The Buddhist sutras, there's a lot of Buddhist texts out there, and many of them are really crazy. They have a lot of really interesting stories in them, and oftentimes, if you're of a certain persuasion, you might see these stories and say, oh, how can you really believe that? Is that really true? We sort of get into that, is this a historical text? Does this actually happen, kind of thing? But if you set that aside and just look at it as literature, there's so many interesting stories in the Buddhist canon that have so many interesting lessons or morals or values. If you just read it as literature, in the same way that you could you could go and see Star Wars and get lots of interesting morals and lessons from that, and you wouldn't be like, oh well, there really is a galaxy far, far away. Well, maybe. So similarly, I think that there's a lot of Buddhist literature that we don't that hasn't really been popularized in the same way. Probably everybody in this room knows about Noah and the Ark, right? There's certain religious stories that are just sort of kind of in the culture, and we all know that story. Does anybody know the story of King Bimbisara? Yeah, see? King Bimbisara was a figure in many Buddhist texts. Really interesting story. His son tried to kill him. In some stories, the son does kill him. The son is friends with the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta. And Devadatta is trying to take over the Sangha. There's all this drama. It's just a really interesting story, and we don't talk about that. And I think there's probably some really interesting lessons and morals in there, and we don't. And I think that when people say, "Oh, well, it's just a philosophy," they end up just looking at the philosophical aspects of it, and not the sort of literary, magical, really interesting aspects of the tradition, which I think we can also learn from.
So the mixture of all of the different priests dilute some of the different types of Buddhism if they were practicing all together in the camp. You know what I mean?
It could have, yeah. But I think in that context, it was also a factor of creating a broader community and sort of supporting everybody.
So it was a good thing.
Yeah. And oftentimes, the reason I brought in the military aspect of the chaplains is because oftentimes people were holding memorials for their children who had been killed in the war. So there's aspects to that are, no less important than, the purity of traditional practice.
I am a member of the Shin Buddhist Sangha of San Diego, 2929 Market Street. These people remember the camps in February or March of every year, they have a sale of Buddhist icons made in the camps. Particularly the Obutsudan, a Buddhist home altar. I'll pass on to Jeff and maybe he'll circulate the announcement. I'm also a global warming activist. Anybody over at IBT or anybody you know trying to merge Buddhism with global warming activism?
Yeah. At my school, there are certainly students who are studying that kind of thing. There's also a lot of movement within the broader community for what's sometimes called eco-dharma or the eco-sangha, which is concerned with all manner of environmental protection kinds of things. And I'm sure if I thought long and hard enough about it, I would be able to come up with a specific person, but nothing's coming to me right now.
Your book focuses on kind of what happened in the past. Where do you see, or what are the influences for the next 10 or 20 years in American Buddhism?
Global warming. In all seriousness, thank you for that question. And whenever I give a talk, somebody will inevitably ask me a version of what's the future look like. And in all seriousness, I actually do think global warming is an important part of that. It's easy to look back at historical trends and say this is sort of where things are coming. Maybe they're going to go this way in the future. But if we take seriously the threat of climate change or political instability or economic problems, those things are going to have an impact on all of us, regardless of what we think or believe or what communities we belong to. And I think they'll have an impact on Buddhism in different ways. So not necessarily climate change, but demographic shifts are an important factor. The Buddhist churches in America that I'm mostly talking about has a declining membership overall. And the basic idea is that it's a sort of membership-based kind of community, but demographics are shifting, right? Like having a membership-based community made sense 70 years ago because everybody was sort of in the same family, sometimes literally. As the community gets older, younger people don't think about joining a community in the same way as they used to, or economic things have changed. They don't have money to join a community like they used to. And so if the community is unable to respond to those kinds of changes, then they might be in trouble. I have no idea. I was going to ask Jeff what his membership model is here.
We don't have members.
Right. How do you stay open? Is it all from the store?
No. We pray to God a lot.
It seems to be working for you. So sort of paying attention to those sort of larger social and cultural factors, I think, is part of the answer to that question. It seems to me that in certain parts of the country, Buddhism is growing in popularity, but then I'm also very aware of a lot of the polarization that we're seeing in this country that is creating sort of more and more factions, ideological factions between people, and that gives me some concern. How is that going to affect how we're able to create and sustain communities? There's a guy in the back.
Curious about your role at the school. Like, how did your school fit into your Buddhism in America? Like, what's the role and whether they study practice or just literature type study?
Yeah, the Institute of Buddhist Studies grew out of the Buddhist churches of America. Initially, when it was established 75 years ago, it was a small study group and focused primarily on Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and training people to become priests within that tradition. Over the last 20, 25 years, our curriculum has expanded and we offer programs in a wide diversity of different Buddhist traditions. And we also have a program for folks who want to become Buddhist chaplains. So the second largest number of students we have are people who are planning on becoming hospital chaplains or doing chaplaincy in other contexts. Our enrollment is up. What's that?
What's your number?
We have about 50 students right now. And it's a graduate program, so 50 students on a graduate program is actually pretty good. Especially for a niche area like Buddhism is.
Are you private or are you publicly funded in any way?
We are private. We are not publicly funded in any way, so I don't have to worry about the Senate calling me in to yell at me about diversity statements. And we are accepting donations, by the way. I'm only supposed to say that.
There's a box over here in the corner.
Great. Is that the praying to God box?
What were the conditions at these camps and were they treated humanely?
I'm gonna say no, only because, well, I think in the abstract, can somebody who's involuntarily incarcerated be treated humanely, even if they're given food and water and whatnot? That's sort of a philosophical question, I guess, or a moral question. But also, most of the camps were set up in pretty remote parts of whatever state they were in. So in Utah, for example, there was a camp called Heart Mountain, which was, you know, kind of out in the high desert, so extremely hot in the summertime and, you know, 3 feet of snow in the wintertime. The camps were hastily built, so they didn't necessarily have a lot of good insulation. And depending on the camp and depending on circumstances, it might have been more or less violent. There were definitely some camps where everyone sort of just, you know, put their heads down and behaved well. And there were other camps where there were a lot of fighting and people actually were killed. So, you know.
I mean, I think the sad, really sad part is all those people who lost everything.
Yeah.
So all their generational wealth, all their belongings, possessions, and, you know,
Yeah.
property, like, it's not just being relocated, like, their whole lives were completely upended, which is shocking.
Yeah.
Many of the camps were former WPA camps.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you see the future of Buddhism in America maybe falling away from Buddhism itself and like leading into more like a term of like mindfulness, where that's been really popular in the last 10, 20 years? People are becoming more aware of mental health, and kids are being taught meditation in schools. Would you still consider that Buddhism, or do you think that's just going to turn into something else where it's just part of everyday culture?
That's a really interesting reflection. I think it's probably both. You know, I think it's definitely true that there are aspects of lots of different religious traditions or spiritual traditions that have sort of diffused into the culture. Mindfulness is a great example, so is yoga. And other, you know, other types of meditation and so forth. I was just talking with a friend a couple of days ago about how kids these days seem much more attuned to mental health issues and taking care of their mental health, and so I think that's undoubtedly a good thing. And I would suspect that would continue, but I don't know if it would displace sort of traditional or institutionalized forms of Buddhism. I think you probably have both. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. You know, one of the interesting things about the introduction of Buddhism to America that I think is really different from how Buddhism has been spreading in other parts of the world is that oftentimes when Buddhism comes into a new cultural context, it gets intertwined with the ruling class pretty quickly. Not always successfully, but and not without some bumps. But like somebody asked earlier about Buddhism coming to Japan, and I mentioned that the king of Korea introduced Buddhism to the emperor of Japan. That tells you something about how Buddhism spread in those contexts, and that can be really valuable because with imperial patronage comes all kinds of infrastructure. You get the funds to build libraries and monasteries and universities and all this kinds of stuff. But that, I have a hard time believing that's going to happen here in America. Not just because of the on the books separation of church and state, but the way in which Christianity is so entrenched within our cultural and political life, it would seem weird to me for Buddhism to displace that. So that's like an interesting thought experiment. Maybe Buddhism is spreading in a sort of covert kind of way through mindfulness and other ways, because I'd be shocked if we elected a Buddhist president. I mean, the country almost had a heart attack when we elected a black president.
It's interesting, that, sorry.
We're talking about right now the blending of Christianity and Buddhism philosophies, like you have in South America, you have the Indian and the Catholic traditions that are kind of blending together. I mean, anything's possible.
Yeah. On a long enough time scale.
It's interesting that like we were just talking about the schools saying it's a philosophy and not a religion, and how that might even be a part of that.
Well, that also to me raises the question of what's institutional religion in general going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years.
Right.
Will there still be churches and synagogues?
I keep thinking about the question earlier about how Buddhism can relate to global warming. And, I don't have a specific experience with Zen Buddhism, but when I was in Thailand, in their Buddhist temples, I thought it was really amazing. You could be in the center of Bangkok and you'd see these giant cranes, right, just in the temple because they knew it was safe. And so it does seem to me that Buddhism just intrinsically creates a safe place and a balance with nature. So maybe not even that there has to be a movement, but through embodying these practices, we could just become better stewards of nature.
That would be nice. And nothing else, the lessons of interdependence are, of course, a huge part of that. But some days I have hope. Did you have another question?
I was just going to say, as a follow-up, that would you consider, like, if someone is meditating and they're Buddhist, or they're following Buddhist traditions, is meditation equal Buddhism?
No, I follow the advice of some of my colleagues who say whoever claims to be a Buddhist is a Buddhist. And so if somebody meditates but doesn't call themselves a Buddhist, then that's fine. Yeah.
I'm just curious, did Hinduism follow the same path as Buddhism in America? Do you know?
Well, I think the short answer is no, it didn't. I'm not an expert in that field.
Because they seem related.
Yeah. But I think a lot of the spread of Buddhism is connected to immigration policy as well. Hinduism is, there's similarity and there's difference in terms of how it's spreading in America. I mentioned yoga. Yoga has some connections to Hinduism, but also modern yoga has connections to lots of other things as well. I know of people in the broader Hindu community who are very concerned about yoga being assumed to be nothing more than exercise or a wellness technique because they feel it has some sort of sacred connection to their religious tradition. And so there's also connections between Hinduism and regional ethnicities within the Indian subcontinent. So there's a whole different history there that I'm just not as familiar with, but So I think you have to look at some of that stuff to
Right.
find the, yeah.
Just curious.
Y'all are super smart, thank you for this great question.
Were there any subversive acts or situations where multiple people or even individuals were claimed to have been participating in anti-American activity, or does the government's official line, quote unquote, say that they prevent all that? But by the incarceration and internment of all the Japanese.
Before the war or during the incarceration period?
The purpose of the internment, I presume, from the government standpoint, would be to prevent. Just curious.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that there were any actual threats, but that's a history that I'm not as familiar with. So I do know that there were, there were definitely folks within the Japanese community prior to the war that were raising money to send back to the families in Japan, and oftentimes that money was going to fund various Japanese war efforts in mainland Asia. So there's, I want to be cautious here and sort of paint in black and white that America, the government bad, Japanese good, whatever. But there's that kind of nuance, or whatever may or may not have happened doesn't justify the mass incarceration, right? Particularly of babies and children, so it's yeah.
They caught 5 people, the FBI did. So they interned 120,000 people to catch 5?
Yeah.
That's not just.
Good work. Real efficient, your tax dollars at work. Yeah.
But even people that sent money home to Japan during the war, the Japanese government was going into ordinary citizens' homes and just taking all their stuff
Yeah.
and raiding it without their consent.
Yeah.
So that would have, as a great, awesome.
Yeah, one more question, or? Yeah.
I'm much more familiar with Tibetan Buddhism than Zen or Japanese. I mean, everybody knows that there's a hierarchy with the Dalai Lama, obviously being the most important. I'm sure you wouldn't agree. So that's the most important person in Tibetan Buddhism. So that's a 2-part question. Number one, does that exist in Zen and Japanese Buddhism, a hierarchical structure? And number 2, what's going to happen when the Dalai Lama dies?
So the first question is easy, yes. There's no person with the same sort of gravitas as the Dalai Lama in Japanese Buddhism, but every school has some sort of hierarchy, even if it's not a very big hierarchy or whatever. So there's always somebody who's in charge. So there's definitely some hierarchies within Japanese Buddhism, sure. I don't know what's going to happen when the Dalai Lama passes away. I suspect that there's going to be a pretty significant international crisis with China. For those who don't know, China's passed a law that says that the Chinese government needs to certify reincarnations of important Tibetan Buddhist teachers. And there's already been some controversy over this. There was recently reincarnate Lama was identified in Mongolia, and that's creating a lot of international tension because Mongolia is trying to have more independence on the world stage, and China's right there, and so on and so forth. America's general policy toward the whole thing is to be like, let's just not talk about that. But I don't know how we're not going to be able to not talk about it when that actually comes to pass. The Dalai Lama has said perhaps that the line of Dalai Lamas will just come to an end with him. I don't think that's gonna happen. I think that the community will say, no, I can imagine a scenario where there are two Dalai Lamas, one endorsed by the People's Republic of China and one endorsed by the Tibetan community, and then that will cause its own problems. I'm not looking forward to it. Great question to end on. I have hope, however, that everything will be okay. Thank you all so much.
It's always the life questions that we remember. So again, I just, thank you, Scott. Thank you for solving the problem or the question of what's going to happen to the Dalai Lama. We've all wondered why.
You heard it here first.
Yes, you heard it here. But seriously, thank you for everything, all your wisdom, all your knowledge, all your humor. Really just a true pleasure and honor to have you here. Very few people have this amount of knowledge and wisdom and actual genuine heart and care for this path and this practice. So for me to have you here in this DharmaRealm temple, especially with the history and the lineage of everything you've discussed, it's really special. So thank you very much. And on that same note, I take full ownership and responsibility for being the one who 3 days ago, maybe 4 days ago, said to Scott, hey, do you have a bunch of books you can bring down? And dropped the ball completely on making sure we had books here prior to his arrival. So we will get them here, and when they get here, you will all get noticed just like you got notified to show up today. So we'll have those here. But thank you again. If you are here for the first time, welcome to the DharmaRealm Temple. We opened this place 17 years ago to introduce Buddhist practice to those who show up. Those of us who lead are not monks, nuns. I guess we do have teachers every once in a while. Gurus, masters are not looking for students. We're just practitioners. So we do our best to take our understanding of Buddhist teachings and put it into terms that hopefully make sense to those who show up. Everything we do here is free. Buddhist practice, meditation, it's free. Just sit, breathe, take care of your own mind and your own madness. Different classes every night from different Buddhist traditions. Every Thursday at 4:30, we do a food redistribution program. Probably one of the best programs here, where we prepare gourmet vegetarian meals, also known as peanut butter and jelly. And we feed people who sleep on the streets every night. So anytime you think your life sucks and you lack gratitude, feed somebody who puts their head on the sidewalk every night to go to sleep. So other than that, thanks for being here. Buddha for you is there downstairs if you need anything. I don't think Scott's running off quite yet, so if you have any follow-up questions, he'll be here. But as always, let's please take care of the space. We have no cleaning crew. We are it. So thank you all for being here. And again, Scott, thank you. Thank you.